speaking about these coconuts that you mentioned, there was actually a banner that I saw recently during one of these anti-Israel marches in London, where there was some young lady who also wrote about these coconuts, and she made a drawing of it. And later, I think actually the police got involved, that this was a form of racism which was not accepted.
Yeah.
But it brings me to the topic of these marches, because this is something that has become quite an important issue right now. Your Minister of Interior, at least until recently, Suella Braverman, lost her job to a large degree over something that she said about these marches and how they are being policed.
Yeah.
In general, it is a topic for many pundits and newspapers. Every time there is a march, this cenotaph monument is being guarded by policemen, and there are those who believe that it's outrageous that something like that should be needed at all, and they are wondering what has happened to social cohesion in the country.
Yeah.
So it does seem that the war in Israel and these marches, they somehow create emotions in British society that maybe people didn't really understand just how much it has changed until this point.
Yeah, and a lot of them don't understand what they're getting emotional about either. I mean, the one of the purposes of the modern British politician for the time being, I think, is pretty much just to showcase how impotent the legislative system is. I mean, Suella Braverman said we've got to tackle immigration. They've been in power for what? How many years? 10 years? I mean, they can't do it. They can't do it within the framework of international human rights and God knows what and everything else they're beholden.
The European Court of Human Rights for many years was the one that held them back.
Yeah, oh, for heaven's sake, probably the UN as well. I mean, you know, we're a country that tries to play by the rules. I mean, one of the reasons for being so shafted by the EU is that, unlike the Italians, we actually try to do what we were told. You know, there's a huge amount of
cultural misunderstanding, maybe.
Well, administrative obedience.
That all of a sudden you're dealing with European continental rules, the French approach or the Italian approach.
Yeah,
which can be quite different compared to the German approach or the British approach.
I think in terms of the approach that Britain has, and actually getting back to the subject of these marches as well, we have an enormous number of people in Britain who, of course, were very quick to jump to the support of the Ukraine at the beginning of Russia's invasion of the Ukraine. And a lot of those same people are now jumping to the support of Palestine. You know, they chant from the river to the sea, and you know, that really is. I'm sorry, there's no way to interpret that slogan other than it's anti the two-party, the two-state solution.
They want a
one-state
solution.
The eradication of Israel,
a Palestinian state.
And there's no. I can't imagine a situation in which Palestine, even if Hamas were taken out, in which Palestine in any shape or form would allow an Israeli population to continue living in the Holy Land. And okay, now the thing is about support for the Ukraine is that it's very much, you know, in terms of the French Enlightenment and Napoleonic law and all of the values which stretch across the continent, I can understand why the Ukraine has to be preserved. It's very important, and you know, it's important to our own stability in the West is that we uphold the principles which uphold the Ukraine as well. And there are two societies in Europe who have fought off the Napoleonic contagion. One of them is Russia, and the other is Britain. Now, that doesn't mean, of course, we're going to support Russia in this war, not at all. We have been, to some extent, reverse colonized by the Americans to believe in you know, the independence of nations and that sort of thing. And
well, after 1945, a lot changed.
Right, yeah, exactly. But I can't understand how... And so it's quite natural that you know, liberal, free-thinking British people would jump to the support of the Ukraine. Fair enough, fine. But how do those same people then jump to the support of Palestine? I don't understand that. You have a legal state in Israel, a democratic state, a very prosperous society which has thrived on the very principles which have made Europe stable for the last 70 years, and on which we hope to make the Ukraine stable. How do you then jump to the support of, I'm sorry, but if they tacitly support Hamas, okay, they would rather see Hamas sort of take over than have a...
I mean, let's be frank about it. If your first reaction is on October 7th or 8th after seeing all of these videos, seeing the surprise attack, seeing the level of violence. And your first instinct is not to condemn the violence you just witnessed, but instead say, but, and then start talking about all of these other typical Palestinian talking points.
Yeah.
Then you're clearly not very strong in your opposition to Hamas.
No, yeah, exactly. I mean, it's much easier to get people riled up over the sight of a dead child than it is to sort of step back and get them to think, well, you know, what are we saying if we advocate for the collapse of statehood in Israel? Where does that put us in the West? Okay. So the first people who settle in a land are the ones who are allowed to form a state there. Even if we accept the premise that the Israeli state isn't a proper continuation of the ancient Israeli nation. Okay. So they pushed some Palestinians off. So what? So does that mean only the white Anglo-Saxons are allowed to have Britain? Only the Native Americans are allowed to have the United States. I mean, I'm sorry, it's such a sort of inconsistent point of view. Of course, we all understand viscerally, you know, the plight of the modern Palestinian, and a sense that his nationhood has been compromised to the extent that there was a state there before, but.
But here in Central Eastern Europe, there are parts that could have some understanding for this type of thinking. For example, right now in the Baltic states, you have certain measures that are being taken to because the demographic changes were large in the Baltic states after the 1940s when the Soviet Union took them over and started sending people in. So it seems to be that there are different opinions about these things, about how long continuity do you need to have, or how recent can a conqueror have arrived. So when does your claim become legitimate? After 50 years, 100, 300?
Yeah, well, no, but I think there is a line in the sand, though, Adam, which is that the claim is legitimate when the United Nations recognize a state. And I think in Western Europe and the United States, that is taken to mean if you have a state, you have a nation. Now, I have to say the British don't think like that. That doesn't mean that we're going to completely disregard, the Ukraine or Israel or anything like that. It's just that that does seem to be the line in the sand. You have a seat at the United Nations. You have an internationally recognized written constitution. We have no written constitution in the UK, right? But you have this idea of nationhood which arises from statehood. And so the Latvians are welcome to throw Russians out of Latvia on that basis.
Speaking about statehood, there is also the debate. There is one right now going on in Spain with the separatists over there, and this big issue over this amnesty law that the prime minister has offered in exchange for 7 MEPs from the separatists to support his government for him to rule another 4 years. Yeah. So many people who are very adamant about Spain maintaining territorial integrity, they're afraid that separatism is becoming an issue. And this is something that you also have in Great Britain. A couple of years ago, there was a referendum in Scotland. And that was a referendum which was lost by the separatists. Yes. But very quickly they said that they want another referendum. And the leader, Nicola Sturgeon, she was on the path on forcing another referendum, or trying, because technically she needs permission from London to do it. And Boris Johnson said that this was a once-in-a-generation thing. You're not getting a second referendum. But she was saying she would do it anyway. Then she disappeared suddenly. What happened in Scotland? Why is she gone?
Well, the details of why. I think, to be honest, having lost that, most if you speak to a Scottish independence voter, they understand that this is dead for a generation. The idea of Scottish independence. Funnily enough, I'm not an independence voter, but I do sympathise with the cause. As they say in Il Tabarro, it's better to be the servant. Better to be the master in a hovel than the servant in a palace. That's the mentality. And it's the same mentality behind Brexit, by the way. We made economic arguments for leaving the EU, but
It was about sovereignty.
It was about sovereignty. It was about sovereignty. At least for me, it was, and I think for maybe we had to make those arguments just to sort of get the electorate on our side. But if Scots want independence, they should have. Yeah, but they voted against it. We're quite lucky in that the vote. It was quite close. It was sort of 49-58 or something. But the Remain vote in Scotland wasn't all concentrated along the English border, which is a blessing because it might have been easy just to move the border north a bit, right? So we couldn't break up the country in the way that the Ukraine broke up after the Maidan. Remember, you have what was he called? The Russian fellow who was voted in before Maidan.
Yanukovych.
Yanukovych, thank you. I mean, all of his voters were crammed up against the east of the country. Or I say all of them, but a lot of them. There was an obvious demographic sort of pro-Russianness in the Crimea and Donbass and Luhansk. Not so in Scotland, I think. So we've saved ourselves that problem. And I think also, although there was a reaction against Brexit, I think Scotland, if that referendum come just after the Brexit referendum, it would have gone the other way probably. But, in the end, they quite like our king.
Well, it's been 320 years almost. Not yet,
years.
but we're closing in from 1707.
Yeah, and they've got their. I remember must have been about the millennium that they got their Parliament at Holyrood. They got a certain amount of delegated power, which, and of course they get an awful lot of things subsidised by us. One of the jokes I made I live in Scotland, so a lot of my friends are Leave voters. I can see the point. One of the jokes I make is that England ought to give Scotland independence and then pay them to invade England. You give them independence on Friday, they raise an army on Saturday, we give them free fuel on the M1 southbound, they get to London on Sunday, we stage a sort of takeover of Downing Street, sell the movie rights to Hollywood, and on Monday we go back to normal, the UK goes back completely to normal, and England has to pay for Scotland's welfare systems, healthcare, education, military defence and so forth, and of course back to square one. Exactly the same situation, except Scotland say they've won a war against England. Quite a good war. Nobody has to get hurt.
Could be a solution.
Yeah, really, it seems to be a very good deal that they've got at the moment, and I don't resent them for it.
What about the Poles? Because Scotland was one of the main bases for the Polish soldiers that were stationed in the UK during the Second World War. Especially a lot of the training camps for the Poles were up north. Also, you had, for example, the famous Wojtek the Bear, who was, I believe it was Edinburgh, if I'm not mistaken.
Was he?
I think it was far up in Scotland somewhere that he ended his days.
Is that right?
Together.
I've heard of Wojtek the Bear. I'm afraid I don't know much about Poles in Scotland. I mean, the Poles who served in the war, of my knowledge, were mostly stationed around Kent. I know you had some very good pilots.
Yes, those were the flyers down there, close to North. Oh, what's it called? Northolt?
Northolt, probably. Yeah, that's quite possible. I mean, they've left their legacy in sort of various military clubs and that sort of thing. And but there's nothing. I mean, I come from the very far north of Scotland.
They were probably more centered around Aberdeen,
perhaps,
Edinburgh, or Glasgow.
Yeah. No, I mean, there's no Polish influence where I'm from. There's very little of anything. Although we have native Gaelic speakers. And from the point of view of the war, the argument for independence is Scottish independence, quite compelling. When I think of the late head stalker on where I live, in the area I live, he's now died, but he grew up speaking Gaelic at home. He was drafted into the army and arrested. I think he was apprehended at the very opening part of the war, so probably Dunkirk or somewhere like that. And he spent the whole war in a Silesian salt mine, digging salt, I suppose, or something like that, for the Wehrmacht in occupied Poland or Czechoslovakia or something like that. And then he returned back to his island in Scotland. and never left again. So his only experience of being a UK citizen was to get a knock on the door from a government whose parliament don't speak the same language as him, to be sent to be a prisoner on the continent. Then he goes back to Scotland, who carries on shooting deer for the rest of his life, occasionally seeing some sort of bratish tourist come up from London. You can sort of see that from the point of view of someone like that. What exactly connects you to the UK? I don't know. It's like this idea the Germans have the idea, because Germany, of course, is a recently consolidated country. They had the idea of Heimat, my homeland, which isn't related to the idea of country or state. It's just, this is my home, my island. What have I got to do with the salt mine in Silesia? Some sort of German commandant shrieking at me in a language I don't understand, fighting for a king whose language I don't speak. So I think there is a rather sort of compelling argument to be made for independence in Scotland. I can see the point. I mean, I wouldn't vote for it myself, but I can understand why people do.
And now, having spent months and months here in Poland, would you say that there are any similarities to the UK in general, but maybe Scotland more in particular?
Yeah.
Apart from the weather, then.
Look, every country probably believes itself to be sort of God's given land, and I believe that to be true. I think our Reformation followed a very, very interesting, unique course in which we replaced the church not with the Bible but with the monarchy. We have a sort of our own sort of homegrown papacy in the institution of the monarchy. But in Poland, you have, the hand of God is at work in Poland in a very strange way. I'll try to summarize it as tersely as I.
Well, there was an author calling it God's playground, Mr. Norman Davis.
I'd say it's not God's kingdom on earth, obviously, but it's the goddamn nearest prototype you could get. You've had this very interesting struggle since the war, in which you've had the apposition of two different types of nationality, which still exists in this country today, or say nationalism, one of which is represented by the Pope, His Holiness John Paul II, people who are willing to stand up for their country. I think you called it yourself a messiah complex that Poland has.
Yes, the legend of being the Messiah of nations.
That's it. That
Poland needs to be crucified and resurrected for the sake of all nations.
It must constantly become its own negation for the sake of all nations, right? And you can sort of see that with people sort of throwing themselves at the barricade and during the Solidarity uprisings in Dansk and the terrible violence that was done to them during martial law. On the other hand, you have modernity here, represented, I think, rather beautifully in a sort of tragically poetic way by the figure of Wojciech Jaruzelski, a nobleman, I think, who lost his sight as well as his...
From a very good aristocratic family,
right,
which fought in every uprising against the Russians.
Always the ones to watch out for. Lost his physical sight and his faith in Russia as a prisoner.
Damaged his eyesight.
Right.
Yeah.
With those dark glasses.
He had to wear those dark glasses because of the reflection in the snow in Siberia.
Snowblind, right. And so you had these two titans of the Polish 20th century. A pope who is, I think, the prince of the church, who was in fact the son of a seamstress from Silesia or something like that. Didn't speak the same beautiful, elegant Polish as the aristocratic Jaruzelski, who was, of course, in charge of the communist regime. And obviously, Jaruzelski was a master of realpolitik and did a deal with the devil, if we're to be as generous as possible, perhaps with the best intention of avoiding the situation that came to Budapest in 1956 and Prague in 1968. And the two met, of course, when His Holiness the Pope came back in 1983, I think, and millions turned out in the streets to greet the Pope, and Brezhnev was furious about this, and come on, Wojtek, why can't you shut this down? And no, I'm sorry, comrade, I can't, this is too powerful. And I think the two of them met in Wawel Castle in Krakow, and I'm not sure if we have actually any record of that conversation they had. It must have been one of the most extraordinary confrontations of the 20th century, really sort of temporal values pitched against, divine law.
Pope John Paul II is not famous for biting his tongue in such situations.
I
He could be quite
yes.
colorful in,
I think
in such encounters.
someone told me, although nobody could hear what was being said, they could hear the staccato cadences of two men absolutely screaming at each other from behind the doors. I think we can assume that Jaruzelski probably said, "Your Holiness, you mustn't interfere with the affairs of a secular state," and of course, what John Paul II himself said to the crowds, he could only have repeated to Jaruzelski, "I'm here for all of you. I'm trying to, I'm representing a kingdom. We aspire to a kingdom not of this world, if you like." And it's a very interesting concept, even if you're not a Christian believer, of salvation, temporal salvation. Of course, the Jaruzelski regime collapsed, and Jaruzelski was then forced to live in a country which was becoming more and more prosperous, which he had tried to save from something much worse. But I think at the end of his tenure, he did what Franco did. He managed to leave the country with enough of a middle class, and he managed to, I think, by force of alcohol most, he managed to get the trade unions to speak to the bourgeois population so that there wasn't a civil war. We might at least accredit him with that. And at the end of his life, in divine salvation, we say, it's in evangelicals would say at least, that it's enough to accept that you have been saved. And I can imagine that in temporal terms that must be a very difficult thing for a communist dictator to have to accept, that things have improved an awful lot. And I think he did so with some humility at least, didn't he? Because he said later on he bitterly regretted having lent support to the Prague uprising and God knows what. And I think at the very end of his life he became a Catholic again. And the people who manned the barricades at the Solidarity uprising crossed the aisle at the church at the funeral to greet his family and offer their condolences. I think it's a rather sort of beautiful sort of ending. I mean, in modernity, any criminal always has to be compared to Hitler. But there are shades of Hitler, and Jaruzelski seems to be more of a Macbeth Hitler than a Richard III Hitler, a tragic figure almost.
Well, when it comes to Jaruzelski, the versions of his motives for what he did and how he handled the situation are many in Poland. There are those who would say that he really was someone who was, as you say, a good player when it comes to realpolitik, but also when it comes to just politics within the country to maintain control. He knew that communism, that the future was up for communism in the Soviet satellite states in Central Eastern Europe. But he wanted to make sure that he himself and his regime would land, as we say, on 4 feet, or like the cat. So I think that a lot of this reconciliation was something that was simply fake.
Yes.
He chose a part of the opposition of the Solidarity trade union, and with them he struck a deal in which they shared some power, but they were also intertwined because many of those people were actually agents of the communist secret services.
Yeah, of course, a complicated situation.
So the first years of the 1990s were a time when a lot of what used to be state property through various different state-owned companies were now being privatized, but they were being privatized in a process that was completely shaped by the former communist secret services. Many of them were now out of a job and so on.
Cronyism lives on, right? Even now.
So he and his Minister of Interior, both of them, they played a very important role in Polish society. And there were some attempts to prosecute both of them at the absolute end of their life, but none of them really, none of those attempts really resulted in anything. In the end, when the Minister of Interior passed away, his wife came with a briefcase to the prosecutors, and they said that, well, here is all the interesting information about various people that my husband had, and he told me that once he's gone, bring this to the authorities. They'll know what to do with it.
Oh, absolutely. And his conversion to Catholicism, his reconversion, I should say. One might as well say, prayer, the last refuge of a scandal. But I think that the point of his trajectory is in terms of God's own country. you have these two great forces pitted against each other, one of the temporal pragmatism and one of sort of aspiration to the divine, to which people were willing to go to their deaths and even sacrifice their families to. And I think what's rather extraordinary is the side that won, obviously, is that side which nobody could have believed in the 70s or 80s that they would make this sort of breakthrough. And they did so with this sort of humility that, you know, in the end, the side that wins is a side that doesn't just want to break open the prison and let all the prisoners out, but it wants to bring out the jailers as well. You know, it wants to bring, I think that last gesture of I don't know who it was, probably who was leading the trade unions in Dansk, that man.
Wałęsa
Wałęsa, thank you.
With the big mustache.
It was a big thing, I think, for him to cross the aisle of the church and greet his former oppressors like that. I mean, Democrats.
There are those who claim that he was a paid communist agent of the
Nevertheless, people in his camp have managed to make that reconciliation too. And I think, you know, Democrats and Republicans in America, take note. Brexiteers and Remainers, take note. Israel and Palestine, take note. Ukraine and Russia, take note. When there's that much at stake, it's actually sometimes easier, I think, to forgive the other side. Because it was a struggle of such enormity, you know, than when it's something very petty like Brexit or something like that, when there's very little at stake, then you become more and more petty about it. I think that Poland has undergone such a trial in the last century that people have been forced to kind of examine not just their lives, but the lives of their oppressors and the life of their nation.
There is certainly a large segment of society that would prefer if there would have been a reckoning in the early 90s. The so-called,
Yes.
in Poland, they often chant a Nuremberg for communism.
Yes.
But
Yes, but their liberators won't let that reckoning happen.
But now more than 30 years have passed, and it has to be said that even though some say that our development was slightly hampered by not having this complete settling of scores in the early 90s and maybe more justice in how these state-owned companies were split up and so on. But nevertheless, it has to be said that over the last 15, 20 years, economic growth, it hasn't been ideal maybe, but it has to be said that from that very deep low position that we started in the early 90s to what we have now, Poland is a completely different society, and we are more prosperous than we probably have been for 500 years or so.
Yeah, I mean, prosperity covers all manner of sins. I think it's a part of what sticks America together, in spite of North America being very culturally divided now. I can't imagine there'd be one nation anymore if they weren't immensely wealthy and have good credit lines and God knows what. But, you know, Poland seems to sort itself out even in very dire situations. There seems to be a national mythos of throwing yourself into the fire and doing it, frankly, for God. I mean, it's very strongly linked with your church. That's the only explanation I can find.
God and nation, and often these two things in Poland are intertwined, especially after the partitions, in which the partitioning powers were usually, at least the two most cruel ones, the Prussians and the Russians, were of a different faith. So for the Poles turning to the Catholic Church,
what it is, Adams, you have a higher monarch than anyone in your system of government. I mean, who cares? You know, oh, look at me, I'm a president, I won lots of votes. Well, shut the fuck up. I mean, the first thing any elected secular president wants to do is shake hands with King Charles. I mean, everyone knows that this system, it's kind of, it runs on its own PR. But you know, Poland, you have something a little bit higher than that.
We did have a ceremony a few years back when Jesus Christ was theoretically made King of Poland.
Was he?
When the Polish president participated and so on.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Unfortunately, there are those who say that due to some formalities and bureaucracy and so on, this is technically not valid.
He didn't sign the contract.
That something should have been done slightly differently for it being true. But also then there are those who say that Jesus Christ, naturally, but traditionally, Mary, Mother of Christ, is the Queen of Poland. And
Right.
that, in many ways, Poland is a Marian society.
The
in that way.
the monarchy proceeds from the society. I mean, it's quite obvious by the crowds that turned up for His Holiness John Paul II.
Oh yes,
It's quite obvious
that is,
who's in charge here.
That is a mass movement that we haven't seen since, and I'm not sure that we will see again anytime soon. I'm afraid that we're probably running out of time. So
it was a great pleasure.
We'll
Thank you,
have to
Adam.
continue this discussion in the future. But
Yeah.
thank you very much for coming on, and hope
And
to
thank
have
you
you
for
back
having
on as
me.
well.
Thank you. Great fun.